Hi everyone, my name's Tommy and today I'll be walking through my calculator project which I made a few days ago that I think is pretty cool. So as you can see in the README, this is a basic command line calculator with a bunch of functions that it supports, as well as having a calculation history and the AND function, which is useful in modern day calculators because you can use the previous answer in a previous calculation in your current calculation, which makes life a lot easier. And so I made this calculator because I thought it was just a good idea to code because calculators are so used in the modern world and it would be cool if I can implement it in my own code. So the first thing we're going to do is go through what a typical calculation would look like. So I'm going to type python3 calculator.py to start the file. So the first thing it's going to ask me is my name, so I'm just going to type in my name and an operator. So say I go with the multiply operator, I'll choose my first number, 4, choose my second number, say 9.3, and then it'll give me a 37.2 answer, which is pretty accurate. And it'll say calculation history updated because there is a history in my calculator, and so I can view the history by pressing V, and I can clear the history by pressing C, and so if I view the history again, there'll be nothing because I just cleared it. And I can type A for another calculation. So this calculator also has the zero division error where I can't divide by 0. So if I type in the divide function and type 4 and then 0, then it'll say cannot divide mod by 0, and then I'll have another option to choose my second number. And as you can see, the ANDS function that I implemented, I can just type ANDS, and so my second number will just be 37.2. So at the end of the day, this calculation will give me 4 divided by 37.2. And yeah, now I think it's time to start with my code so you guys can see how I implemented this calculator. So I have two Python files. The bulk of my code is all in calculator.py, and I only have some operations in operations.py because it's just used to store basic functions that I use in my calculator. So the first thing I did was import that file with import operations, and then I added all of them to a dictionary where the key is the string of the operator, and then the value is the operator function itself. And so I created this dictionary in order for a way for the user to say what function they want without having to actually type in the actual function. So they could just type in a string like the slash symbol, which is equal to divide. And I have a lot of these functions here that are all called in the main function that I use, which is called start. So I'll walk through start because that's basically how the calculator runs. So the first thing I do is set history to an empty array because I think that storing history in an array was a good idea because it's very, very easy to clear. You could just use a .clear statement, and you can easily add onto the array by using .append. And I set my first variable to true because in the code, there are a lot of scenarios in which first calculation is different from a second calculation and so on. Because the first calculation, it kind of introduces the user to the calculator and what it does, as well as the first calculation doesn't have an ANDS available because they didn't do a previous calculation yet. And so it'll print the welcome to Tommy's calculator, and then the first function that I call is getName. So in getName, it's just a simple, it interacts with the user by using the input function. And so the user will see what's your name, as I saw up here, and then they can type in their name, and that's what it returns. And then so it'll set the name that the user typed in to the local function variable name. And then this while true statement here is the actual calculation. So every iteration of the while loop is equal to one calculation. So the first thing I get from the user is the prompt, which is, no, not the first thing I get from the user. The first variable I set is the prompt variable, which is a simple string that will be used to pass into the get operation function. So as you can see here, the if first and else statement just kind of changes the string a bit. So the first calculation, the user will see hi, their name, and then the second and third and fourth and the so on calculations, they'll see sure because they don't need to be introduced to the calculator again. And then so once I have that prompt, I'll put it into the get operation function. So the get operation function is up here it utilizes the dictionary that I made earlier, and then it checks to see if the symbol they put in matches one of the keys here, and then it'll output both the symbol and it'll output the function, as you can see in this return line here. And then if the symbol isn't, or the symbol that the user inputted wasn't in one of the symbols in the dictionary here, then it'll print not a valid operation, try again. And then if that happens, there will be another while loop iteration, and then it'll ask for another symbol for the user to try putting in. So that basically that function just gives me the symbol and the operation that I need to make the calculation. And so once I have those two variables, then I would ask the user for the two numbers that they want to use. And so there's another if first and else statement like before. This is where the numbers that they choose can be included with ands, as in the first calculation they can't use ands because they haven't done a previous calculation yet. And so and also for number 2, I make sure that they can't use 0, or they can't use 0 if they use a division or modulo operator, because you can't divide by 0 or mod by 0. And there are 4 parameters to my function. I'll go over them in the up here. So prompt is just the string that I put down that the user sees. Allow 0 is if they allow 0 if the symbol that they put is division or modulo. So if it's not, then it would allow 0. And then allow ands just checks if this was their first calculation. If it was their first calculation, then it wouldn't allow ands. And ands is the actual previous calculation, which I store in the result variable. So this is another while true statement. Every loop is basically just an attempt to get a number. And so the first thing I do is ask them for the number that they want, and then I'll take that number and then I'll strip and lower it. Those two functions are important because say the user types a lot of spaces and then they type the number that they want, say 7, and then they type spaces after that, then the strip function will automatically clear those spaces and just give the computer 7, because that's what's important. And the lower function goes from takes a string, and if it's uppercase, then it'll transform it to lowercase. And so that's important because say the user accidentally types capital ANS, then the lower function just interprets that as lowercase ANS, and then that's what the computer wants. So the first check if statement I have here is check if they typed in ands, and if they did, if ands is allowed, then I'll return ands as the number, and if not, then I'll say that there's no ands available, and then the while loop will continue. And then if they didn't type ands, then I'll put the number through a float function. And for a float function, it can only accept like floats or like integers. And so if they don't put that in, then there'll be a value error. And so that's why I have an except statement where it accounts for that, where it'll print this not a valid number, try again, and then it'll continue the while loop, which basically ignores everything below the continue line and then restart the while loop. And so if everything checks out and it's an actual number, then I'll check finally if 0 is not allowed and if the number is 0, because if 0 isn't allowed and they actually chose 0, then they can't use it. So I'll just print cannot divide by 0. And if that's not the case, then it'll finally return the number. So this function kind of goes through a lot of hoops to make sure that there's no funny business going on when using numbers. So I'll do that twice, number 1 and number 2. So now I have all 4 variables that I need. I have the 2 numbers and I have the operator along with the operator function that can actually do the calculation. So then in my result here, I save it to a variable where it just executes the operator that they chose with the 2 numbers, and then I'll put that result in an F string called calculation, which is what they see on the user end. And so I use an F string because it's a lot easier to kind of like display values that are stored in a local variable. Because if I didn't use an F string, then I have to do a lot of like plus signs and a lot of quote signs, which is more tedious. So an F string would make that process a lot easier. So it'll just be number 1, symbol number 2 equals result. So obviously, because the curly brackets are there, it won't actually print number 1, but it'll print the value associated with number 1, which in this case could be the number that they chose. So an example of a calculation which would be right here, like 4, and then the operator, and then 9.3 equals the result, which is 37.2. So then I'll print the calculation, I'll add that calculation to my history array, and then the last part of the calculation is the get next action function, where they have a lot of options to see what they want to do after they make their calculation. So from the menu here, there's 4 options, and these 4 options are all accounted for in the get next action function. And so it's another while loop where it takes in what they type in, it strips and lowers it, and then so basically if they type exit, then I'll return the string called exit, which will eventually break the while loop in the start function, which will end the entire the whole calculator. And if they type V or C for clear history or view the history, then it'll do those respective actions, and then it'll return nothing. And because it returns nothing, then the while true statement would go again, and then they'll be shown the menu again, because then they can continue on to what they want to do. And if they chose A, then it'll return nothing as well. It doesn't really matter, because it'll kind of just go through this if statement here and then go through the whole while loop again. And then so they'll have another option to do another calculation. And if their input is none of that, then it'll just print not a valid input, and then because of the while statement there, it'll just go again, and they get to choose another input. And one quick note, or 2 quick notes. The first one is for history.clear, it's important to make sure that you don't just do like history equals empty array, because history is just a pointer, right? It's a local variable pointing to an actual object. So if you just do history equals empty array, then it'll just point to something else and it won't actually make the original array empty. But this clear function makes sure that it actually clears what the history was pointing to, which was the actual array. And you might be wondering like what these parameters are for. So basically, if I want to have this get next action function outside of the start function, then like get next action doesn't really know what the local history is or what the local name is of the person, because those are all like local variables for the start function. And so in order for get next action to access that, I would just basically need to add it as a parameter. And so in my start function, when I call operation get next action, I put in the history and the name at the very end, so that my get next action function can access those variables. And so after that, there will be a first equals false statement, which basically means that after the while loop has run once, then first would equal to false, so that in all future calculations, the computer knows that this isn't the user's first time doing a calculation, and it'll operate differently. And then, yeah, that's basically all my code. I thought it was a cool project, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments below.